I'll begin in the requested voice and keep this first installment continuous without headings or recap. The lead masks case rests on a warm hillside above Niterói, and tonight we follow it slowly, as if your hand were already on the edge of the old file. There is no rush here, and the case is patient with us. You begin with the air on Morro do Vintém, the penny hill, where grass moved in the coastal wind and the bay lay somewhere below, bright and ordinary in the distance. It was August of 1966, and the afternoon carried the dry smell of earth, leaves, and city dust, the kind that settles on shoes and paper alike. In the lead masks case, even the first page feels sun-warmed and quiet, as though someone folded it away before the questions had cooled. You can imagine the file as it might sit in front of you now, not crisp and new, but softened by years of handling. The corners have gone pale. The ink has faded in places. A clerk's stamp leans slightly to one side, and somewhere in the folder there is the faint smell of old glue, tobacco, and paper kept too long in a cabinet. We turn that first page together, and we let the case come forward gently. The names arrive before the mystery does. Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana. Two electronics technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, a city north of Rio de Janeiro. Men with workbenches, tools, parts, radios, wires, and the familiar patience of people who understood circuits, one small contact at a time. You sit with those names for a moment, because names matter in a cold file. They keep the case from becoming only a strange object on a hill. Manuel was in his early 30s. Miguel was a little older. They had families, routines, and the ordinary weight of errands and plans. When you read about them now, decades later, it can be easy for the lead masks to pull your eye first because the image is unusual and difficult to forget. But we begin with the men because any patient investigation must begin there, with lives that were larger than their final entry in a police report. On the morning of the 17th of August, 1966, they left Campos dos Goitacazes and traveled toward Niterói. You can hear the low sound of the bus if you let the file breathe a little, the engine's steady hum, the soft creak of seats, the murmur of passengers with bags at their feet. The road was long enough for thoughts to settle and shift. Fields passed, then towns, then the thicker feeling of the coast. The ticket matters because it gives the case a line to follow. Investigators often begin with lines like that, not with answers, but with a path drawn by something small and paper-thin. A bus ticket, a receipt, a remembered purchase. You can almost feel the thin ticket between your fingers, dry and fragile, carrying more importance than it was ever meant to carry. It says, in its quiet way, that the men went somewhere deliberately. By early afternoon, Manuel and Miguel were in Niterói, across the water from Rio de Janeiro. The city would have been busy in the usual human way, with footsteps, shop doors, tram and bus noise, voices passing from street to street. They did not vanish into a wilderness. They moved through ordinary places, where people saw them and later tried to remember exactly what they had seen. That is one reason the lead masks case stayed open in people's minds. They were said to have bought waterproof coats. You pause there because the detail is plain but curious. Raincoats have a texture you can picture easily, smooth and faintly rubbery, folding with a stiff whisper in a shopkeeper's hands. The men were already wearing suits, according to later descriptions, and now they added coats against weather that may or may not have concerned them. Investigators would return to that purchase, because cold cases often live in these modest errands. They also stopped for water. A bottle, handed across a counter, perhaps still cool from storage, perhaps damp against the palm. You can place yourself in that small exchange, the clink of glass, the smell of a bar or shop in the afternoon, the human ease of buying something for later. If the person behind the counter looked at them closely, it may only have been for a second. Years of mystery can grow from a second that seemed too ordinary to keep. This is how patient detective work begins to feel. Not like a chase, and not like a sudden revelation, but like sitting with ordinary acts until they slowly take on weight. You underline the raincoats. You underline the water. You write Niterói in the margin, and maybe Campos dos Goitacazes beside it. because distance matters too. These men had not simply wandered up a familiar hill after lunch. Morro do Vintem was not a grand place in the polished sense. It was a hillside, uneven and open, with scrub, grass, rocks, and views that could draw the eye outward toward the bay. The name itself, Penny Hill, has a humble sound. You can imagine dust on the path, the dry scrape of weeds against trousers, the heat held in stones after hours of sun. We follow them there only as far as the evidence lets us. Some time later, a young person flying a kite came across what the city had not yet noticed. The kite detail stays with many people, perhaps because it belongs to childhood and sky, not to a police file. You can feel the tug of string between fingers, the little pull and slack of wind, the paper or cloth shape moving above the hill. Then the hillside gives up something it had held for days, and the case changes hands. We do not need to linger on the condition of the scene. For our purposes tonight, it is enough to say that Manuel and Miguel were found on Morro do Vintem, dressed in suits and raincoats, with handmade lead masks near or over their eyes. They appeared to have no obvious signs that explained what had happened. The place was quiet again by then, just grass, heat, and a view that could not answer back. The masks are the object everyone remembers. You can picture them not as theatrical things, but as crude, practical pieces cut from sheet lead, shaped to cover the eyes. Lead has a dull heaviness, a grey surface that seems to hold fingerprints and shadow. If you lifted one, it would not feel like a costume piece. It would feel like material from a workshop, dense and cold, made by hands that had a purpose in mind. That purpose is where the file begins to resist us. Electronics technicians might have known lead as shielding, as a substance used where radiation or certain kinds of exposure were a concern. But these masks had no clear lens, no ordinary way of seeing through them, and no simple practical explanation. You sit with that fact gently, because a thing can be meaningful without being understood. The case went cold partly because meaning never became proof. There was also a note. In many versions of the file, it becomes the center of the room, the page everyone leans toward. The wording was brief, awkward, and strange, giving instructions about being at a determined place, taking capsules at 6:30, protecting metals after the effect, and waiting for a mask signal. Written plainly, it still feels like something overheard from a private system of belief. You can imagine the notebook paper, its fibers slightly raised, its edges soft from being carried in a pocket. A handwritten note always has the presence of a person, even when it refuses to explain the person's mind. The letters may lean, the spacing may tighten, the ink may press harder in one place than another. Investigators had the words, but not the context that made those words useful. This is one of the first reasons the lead masks case went cold. It did not lack details. It had too many details that did not connect cleanly. There were raincoats, suits, masks, a water bottle, a note, a trip from Campos to Niterói, and perhaps talk of experiments or spiritualist ideas. Each piece invited attention, but no piece settled the question. You turn them over slowly, and still they do not lock together. In 1966, forensic tools were not what they would later become. The handling of a scene, the testing of substances, the preservation of small trace evidence, all depended on methods, resources, and urgency that varied from place to place. You can hear the older office around the investigators, the typewriter keys, the ring of a telephone, the scrape of a chair on worn flooring. They were working with what they had. The bodies had also been exposed before examination could give a clear answer. Weather, time, insects, heat, and the open hillside all took away information before anyone knew how much would be needed. In a cold case, absence can become as heavy as evidence. The missing toxicology result, the unclear cause, the witness who cannot be found again. The question that would have been simple if asked on the first day. You sit at the desk and let that sink in. A case can go cold, not because no one cared, but because time moved faster than the investigation could. The Hill did not preserve everything. The papers did not explain everything. The people who saw Manuel and Miguel in Niterói had only brief glimpses to offer, and brief glimpses soften quickly in memory. But there was one more detail waiting in the file, and it brings us back to the journey before the Hill. The men had not arrived in Niterói, empty of intention. They had money with them when they left home, and some accounts suggest they told family members they were traveling for business, perhaps to buy equipment or parts. You can feel how ordinary that explanation might have sounded at the door. A work trip, a purchase, a return expected later. Families learn the shapes of these routines, and they do not always question them. In the quiet of our reading, you can place their work beside their final errand. Electronics, in that era, had a special kind of mystery around it for ordinary people. Radios, transmitters, improvised devices, wires, batteries, and homemade equipment carried the promise of hidden signals. A person who understood circuits could seem close to unseen worlds, not in a supernatural way necessarily, but in the plain wonder of invisible messages moving through air. That matters because the lead mask's case grew up in a time when technology and belief sometimes overlapped in unusual ways. Brazil, like many places, had circles of spiritualists, experimenters, hobbyists, and people who believed in communication beyond ordinary senses. Some were sincere, some were careless, some mixed science language with private rituals, and some were simply curious people trying to understand a universe that felt larger than daily life. You do not have to accept every rumor to understand why investigators listen to them. Cold case work often means sorting the soft facts from the hard ones. The hard fact is that the men were electronics technicians. The hard fact is that they carried a note about capsules, metals, a signal, and masks. The softer question is whether they believed they were preparing for an experiment, a spiritual event, or something guided by another person. The phrase "protect metals" has always had a strange weight. You can read it aloud softly, and it still sounds like instruction from a world we cannot quite enter. Protect metals. Await signal. Mask. The words are simple, yet the order feels incomplete, as though the missing explanations sat in another notebook or in a conversation no one recorded. Investigators had the instruction sheet, but not the lesson that came before it. There were reports that Manuel and Miguel had interests beyond ordinary repair work. They may have been involved in experiments with electronics and unusual beliefs. The file is careful here, or it should be, because belief does not explain death by itself. People carry strange hopes and private theories all the time. Most return home, put their tools away, and sleep in their own beds. Still, when you sit with this section of the case, you sense why detectives kept circling back to the men's inner world. If they went tomorrow do Vintem willingly, what did they expect to happen there? If they wore or carried lead masks by choice, what did those masks protect them from in their minds? If capsules were taken, what were they, and who supplied them? These are patient questions, not dramatic ones. The difficulty is that each question opened into another room. Suppose the capsules existed. Were they medicine, narcotics, sedatives, or something harmless that later vanished from the record? Suppose someone else wrote or dictated the note. Was that person a guide, a friend, a fraud, or only a voice in a plan the men already believed? Suppose the masks were shielding. Shielding from what? Light, radiation, a signal. This is how the lead mask's case asks you to work. It does not hand you a single locked door. It gives you several doors, each with a different keyhole, and none with enough light underneath. You turn the page slowly, and you notice the pressure on the detective too. Every theory must explain the note, the masks, the journey, the lack of a clear cause, and the silence after it all. The human mind wants a clean line. It wants one thing to be the thing. But old investigations often resist that kind of comfort, because human beings make plans out of mixed motives and half-explained hopes. Manuel and Miguel may have been practical men at workbenches, and they may also have been men drawn toward unusual promises. Those two truths can sit in the same room. Years later, something shifted in the file whenever people returned to the missing cause of death. The autopsy could not give the answer that investigators needed. That is another quiet reason the case went cold. Without a firm cause, the legal shape of the case remained blurred. You can imagine the medical paperwork, the formal language, the careful limits of what could and could not be said. A report is not a story. It will not fill empty spaces just because the living want it to. If poison was suspected, The testing did not provide the solid conclusion that would have changed everything. Accounts differ in small ways, as old case accounts often do, but the broad problem remains the same. The bodies had been exposed, and the exact substance, if there was one, was not confirmed in a way that could carry the investigation forward. The file kept the question and lost the chemical answer. You can almost feel the frustration in that kind of absence. A detective waits for a laboratory result, and the corridor outside the office smells faintly of floor wax, paper, and rain brought in on shoes. The answer comes back thin, inconclusive. Not enough. No definitive cause. A phrase like that can close a door without locking it, leaving everyone standing in the same dim room. The note's mention of capsules became important because of that gap. If the men took something at 6:30, as the note instructed, then toxicology might have been the clearest path. But a note is not a lab result. It only says what someone intended or wanted someone else to believe they intended. You read it again, and the paper stays silent. It does not tell you whether the capsules were real. This is where patient detective work becomes a discipline of humility. We can say the note mentioned capsules. We can say the cause was not firmly established. We can say the masks were made of lead and the men were found on Morro do Vintem. But we cannot make those facts confess more than they know. A cold case asks for care with the empty spaces. The hillside itself had its own limitations. It was not a sealed room. It was open land, reachable by others, exposed to weather, difficult to preserve once discovered. Footprints may have been disturbed, small objects may have been missed, moved, or taken. The grass would have bent under many feet after the discovery, and every footstep added confusion to a scene already full of it. You can picture an investigator standing there, looking down toward the city, notebook in hand, the wind moving the pages. There would be the smell of sun on dry vegetation, the rough ground under shoes, the distant sound of traffic softened by height. It is a calm image now from far away, but for the person responsible for answers, it must have felt delicate. Too much had already been altered by time. The coldness of a case is often made in those first hours. Before anyone knows it will matter for decades. A bottle is handled, a path is crossed. A witness speaks loosely, then more carefully later, then perhaps differently after reading a newspaper account. Rumor begins to gather around the facts like dust on a shelf. By the time the file is old, the dust has its own shape, and the lead masks case gathered rumor quickly. It had all the elements that invite speculation. 2 technicians, handmade masks, a hill, a note, possible capsules, and no clear cause. Some people spoke of unusual lights. Others spoke of experiments. Others wondered about spiritualist rituals or contact with forces beyond ordinary understanding. The stranger the explanation became, the harder it was to keep hold of the simple evidence. As you sit with the file tonight, you may notice how often the case asks to be pulled back down to the table. Not dismissed, not mocked, only steadied. The paper has weight, the names have weight, the masks have weight. The theories float more easily, and because they float, they can drift too far from Manuel and Miguel, who were real men with real families waiting for them. Across town, and then back in Campos dos Goitacazes, those families became part of the investigation's quiet ache. When someone does not come home, time changes texture. A clock becomes louder, a doorway gathers attention. Ordinary sounds, a bus in the street, a footstep outside, a voice near the gate, can seem for a moment to be the answer. You can imagine a family member holding on to the practical explanation first. Delays happen, work takes longer. Roads are slow. Men who travel for parts may return late. Then the practical explanations begin to thin. Police are contacted. Questions are asked. The last trip is reconstructed, piece by piece, from Campos to Niterói, from the bus station to the shop, from the shop to the hill. Each witness adds a small patch of cloth to a larger fabric, though the fabric still has holes in it. For relatives, those holes are not abstract. They are places where grief keeps entering. The men's homes and belongings were examined, and stories emerged about tools, equipment, and possible experiments. You can feel the difference between a workbench in daily use and a workbench searched after a death. The same coils of wire, screws, radio parts, notes, and metal scraps become evidence because the person who understood them is gone. The room still smells of dust, oil, warm solder, and handled wood. Investigators had to ask whether Manuel and Miguel built the masks themselves. That question matters because workmanship can point toward intention. Lead sheeting does not shape itself. Someone chose it, cut it, bent it, kept it, carried it. You might run your thumb near the edge in imagination, careful of its roughness, and wonder whether it was made quickly, confidently, or from instructions no longer present. If the men made the masks, then the masks belonged to their plan. If someone else made them, then another hand enters the case more strongly. But old files do not always preserve the kind of workshop comparison we might want now. Tool marks, metal sources, purchase records, and fingerprints may not have been pursued with later standards in mind. The question remains steady and unresolved. This is another reason the case went cold. The physical evidence was strange, but strangeness is not the same as direction. A detective can hold a lead mask, weigh it, describe it, photograph it, and still not know what it was for. Evidence needs context to become a path. Without context, it becomes an object in a box, visited again and again by people hoping it will say more. You turn another page, and there is the note again, because the note keeps returning like a small echo. Be at the determined place. At 6:30, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals. Await signal. Mask. Even paraphrased, even softened by translation, it carries the rhythm of preparation. The men were not merely going somewhere. They seemed to be waiting for something. Waiting is central to this case. The men waited, perhaps on the hill. Families waited at home. Investigators waited for reports. Later, readers and researchers waited for some overlooked document to surface from an archive. You and I wait too. In our quieter way, with the file open and the room dim around us. A cold case is often a long practice in waiting without forcing the answer. The patient human part is easy to overlook when the details are unusual. Someone had to identify the men. Someone had to speak with their families. Someone had to write the reports, collect the objects, read the note, and decide which lead might be worth following. These were not glamorous tasks. They were the slow work of care, done under fluorescent light, in offices where the air may have felt stale by evening. When the next box comes down from the shelf, it brings with it the stories people told after the facts were already known. When the next box comes down from the shelf, it brings with it the stories people told after the facts were already known. You can hear the cardboard shift against the table, dry and faintly dusty, as if the archive itself has exhaled. Inside that box, the lead masks case becomes less like a single police file and more like a small room full of voices. Some careful, some uncertain, some repeating what they had only heard from someone else. We sit with those voices gently, because memory is a human material, and it bends under weather, fear, newspaper ink, and time. The first kind of story was the witness story, the ordinary account of seeing two men in a city where many men passed by every hour. Someone remembered them buying raincoats. Someone remembered them buying water. Someone may have noticed their suits, their manner, the way they seemed neither panicked nor lost. You can place yourself behind the counter for a moment, with coins in your palm and the smell of glass bottles, damp wood and street dust nearby. At the time, it would not have felt like history walking past. That is the quiet trouble with eyewitness memory in the lead masks case. It began as common observation, and only later became evidence. A shopkeeper who sold raincoats had no reason to study every seam, every expression, every word. A person who served water had no reason to know that the bottle would later matter. By the time investigators asked for details, the ordinary afternoon had become a remembered afternoon. And remembered afternoons are softer around the edges. You turn those statements carefully, and you notice how much depends on timing. If Manuel and Miguel arrived in Niterói in the early afternoon, if they bought items soon after, if the note mentioned 4:30 and 6:30, then the day becomes a kind of narrow channel. You can almost draw it with a pencil, lightly, without pressing too hard. Bus arrival, purchases, hill, waiting. After that, the pencil reaches the blank part of the page. The blank part matters most. In many cold cases, the mystery is not only what happened, But what cannot be placed on the timeline, who saw them between the last shop and Morro du Vintem, whether anyone joined them, whether the men walked calmly or were guided, whether the water bottle was opened before they reached the hill, or after, or not at all. We look at these questions one at a time, and none answers completely. A patient detective learns to respect the distance between possible and proven. It is possible they met someone. It is possible they followed instructions from a trusted person. It is possible they were alone. But a file cannot be built from possibility alone, not if it wants to hold its shape after decades of handling. You can feel that discipline in the old reports, where the useful words are often plain, and the uncertain ones are left standing where they belong. Then the newspapers arrive in the story, rustling into the room like another kind of weather. In 1966, the lead masks case was unusual enough to travel beyond the local offices in the hillside. Reporters saw the same details everyone saw, and those details carried themselves easily into print. Two men, lead masks, a cryptic note, a hill overlooking the bay. No clear cause, even written calmly, the facts created their own atmosphere. You can imagine a newspaper page spread on a kitchen table, its ink faintly smudging a thumb, the paper smelling of pulp and morning air. Someone reads the headline aloud. Someone else remembers hearing about unusual lights, or spiritual groups, or secret experiments. Soon the file has a public life as well as an official one. That public life becomes noisy even when the original place on the hill remains quiet. This is one more reason the case went cold. Public attention can help an investigation, but it can also crowd it. New tips may arrive with real value, yet they may be mixed with rumors, inventions, and honest mistakes. Detectives must sift them without contempt. They must listen, ask, compare, and write. You can see them at desks late in the day, the metal fan turning warm air, the ashtray filling, the telephone ringing again. The strangest theories took root because the physical evidence looked as though it belonged to a ritual or experiment. The masks covered the eyes, or were meant to. The note spoke of a signal. The men worked with electronics. Some accounts connected them with spiritualist circles, or with the hope of contacting unseen forces. You do not have to lean toward the most unusual explanation to understand why people did. The human mind searches for a pattern that feels equal to the mystery. A simple accident may seem too small for such a strange scene. A private belief may seem too vague. A crime may seem possible, but hard to prove. And so, the lead masks case drew explanations that widened beyond the available evidence, until some tellings became more cloud than paper. We bring it back down, softly, to the table. There is comfort in the table. There is the file, the note, the names, the known route, the hillside. There is the dry smell of old pages and the faint roughness of a photograph's edge. You return to what can be touched, because touch is a useful guard against drifting too far. The mystery remains, but it becomes quieter when held close to the evidence. Years later, when people retold the lead masks case, they often began with the masks because the masks make the image immediate. But you and I can pause before that image and ask a slower question. Why would two practical men make or carry such objects? If they believed the masks protected them, what did they believe was coming? If another person told them to use the masks, why did they trust that person? Trust is an invisible part of many investigations. It does not leave fingerprints in the usual way. It appears in decisions, in journeys, in the willingness to follow instructions that would seem strange to someone outside the circle. Manuel and Miguel traveled from their home city, bought items, reached a hill, and seemed to have followed a plan. Somewhere before that day, trust may have formed around an idea or a person. You can sit with that without making it harsh. People trust for many reasons. They trust friends, fellow experimenters, spiritual guides, teachers, colleagues, and men who speak with confidence. They trust because they hope. They trust because a promise sounds close to something they already believe. In cold files, trust often appears only after it has been broken, or after it has led someone somewhere they did not return from. Investigators had to consider whether the men were deceived. That possibility sits quietly beside the possibility of self-directed experiment. If someone supplied capsules, if capsules were taken, then that person would matter. If the men expected payment, equipment, a meeting, or a demonstration, then the plan may have included more than the two of them, yet no third person emerged clearly enough to carry the weight of an answer. The note, again, does not name a guide. It does not say who chose the place. It does not say what the signal would be. It sounds like a reminder written by someone already familiar with the larger plan. You know how notes to ourselves often work? They leave out the very thing an outsider needs, because the writer already knows it. That private shorthand is gentle in daily life but difficult in a police file. Imagine finding a note in your own coat pocket from a week ago. By wire. Meet Paolo. Bring meter. Check signal after 6. To you, it might be obvious. To a detective decades later, it might open 10 different doors. The lead masks case rests partly on that kind of private shorthand, enlarged by loss until every omitted word feels important. We read the note, and the note does not read us back. There were also questions about money. The men reportedly carried funds, and not all of it was accounted for in simple public tellings. Money in a cold case can suggest purchase, theft, debt, or payment, but only when the record is clear enough. Here again, the path becomes soft. You can hear coins and folded bills as ordinary items first, tucked into a pocket for a trip. Later, they become another question. If they intended to buy electronics equipment, where was that purchase to happen? If they spent money on raincoats and water, what else did they buy? If any money was missing, was it used before the hill, taken after, or misreported in the retelling? A detective cannot simply point to an absence and call it motive. The file asks for patience, and patience asks us not to sharpen what is still blurred. So we wait with the blurred places. We let them be blurred. This may be the deepest discipline in a case like this, because the imagination wants to fill every space. But good cold case work is not only the search for an answer, it is also the refusal to damage the truth by forcing it into a shape too soon. You rest your hand beside the file, and you let the quiet do some of the work. Across the years, another kind of investigator came to the lead masks case, not always with a badge, but with curiosity and access to archives. Writers, researchers, former officers, local historians, and people drawn to unresolved files returned to the same points. They traced the bus trip, they compared translations of the note, they studied the masks as objects, they asked whether any laboratory result had been overlooked. You can picture them in different rooms, many years apart. One sits under a library lamp, the shade warm against the darkening evening. Another reads microfilm, the machine humming softly, headlines passing in pale strips of light. Another speaks with someone who was young at the time, whose memory has the softness of an old photograph kept in a drawer. The case moves through their hands, never quite closing. That continued attention matters. A case can go cold officially and still remain warm in human memory. Families remember. Local people remember. The lead masks case became part of Brazil's long shelf of mysteries, not because it was loud, but because it was unresolved in a way that felt oddly precise. There were too many details to forget, and too few to solve it. When you read about Morro do Vintém now, you may find the landscape has changed in your mind many times. First, it is only a hill. Then it becomes the place where two men waited. Then it becomes a scene searched by police, crossed by reporters, revisited by curious people. The ground remains ground, but memory layers over it. You can almost hear dry grass underfoot, then paper turning, then rain against a window decades later. The raincoats return in that layered memory. They are so practical. A person buys a raincoat because rain is possible, or because an instruction says to bring protection, or because some expected effect requires covering the body. We do not know. But the object itself is familiar. You have likely held something like it. A plastic coat folded into a bag, smelling faintly of rubber and storage. Its plainness makes it more puzzling, not less. The suits are plain too, in another way. Men traveling for business might wear suits. Men attending a formal meeting might wear suits. Men taking part in a ritual or experiment might dress according to their own sense of seriousness. Clothing can show intention, but not always its meaning. You can see why detectives noted it, and why the notation did not carry them far enough. A file like this teaches us how little certainty can be extracted from appearance alone. A suit is not a confession. A raincoat is not an explanation. A mask is not proof of what the wearer believed. Even the note, the most verbal object in the case, remains partial and closed. Each item says, yes, there was a plan. None says, with full clarity, what that plan truly was. This is where the case's stillness becomes almost instructive. It asks us to sit with intention without understanding. Manuel and Miguel did not seem randomly placed in the story. They moved toward Niterói, toward the hill, toward a time named in the note. Yet intention can belong to many kinds of plans, including mistaken ones, hopeful ones, manipulated ones, and private ones that make sense only inside a small circle. But there was one more set of questions that slowly gathered around the men's work and around the word signal. Electronics in the mid-20th century carried a different kind of wonder than it does now. Today, invisible signals are so common that we barely notice them. Phones, routers, towers, satellites, and screens fill the air with ordinary expectation. But for technicians like Manuel and Miguel, radio and electronics still had the texture of craft. You tuned, adjusted, listened, soldered, measured, and waited for a response. You can imagine a radio workshop in Campos dos Goitacazes. Its surface is crowded but familiar. There might be spools of wire, small screws in tins, a meter with a needle trembling behind glass, and the warm mineral smell of solder when metal meets heat. A technician's hands learn patience. They learn not to hurry a delicate connection. They learn that a poor contact can make a whole circuit fail. That patient craft may have shaped how the men understood the world. When a person spends years making invisible signals audible, the boundary between seen and unseen can feel more porous. It means they had daily proof that what cannot be seen may still be real. Radio itself is a kind of disciplined faith grounded in equipment, math, and repetition. So when the note said to await a signal, investigators had to think about both the practical and the symbolic. Was it a radio signal, a visual signal, a sign expected during an altered state, a phrase from a belief system, a cue from another person? You read that word slowly, signal, and you can hear how it belongs to many worlds at once. That is why it did not narrow the case enough. The lead masks may also have seemed technical to the men. Lead shielding has a place in certain kinds of protection, especially where radiation is imagined or understood. But the handmade masks were crude, and their actual usefulness remains doubtful in the context we know. A tool can be made from real technical knowledge and still be used for a mistaken purpose. That mixed quality keeps the lead mask's case difficult to settle. You sit in the archive and let the materials speak in their own simple language. Lead is heavy, paper is light. Ink fades. A raincoat keeps water off the body, but not questions from gathering. A bus ticket marks travel, not motive. These are humble things, and old investigations are often built from humble things. They do not glow. They wait. If there was an experiment, it may have been one the men understood through private language. If there was a ritual, it may have borrowed the words of science. If there was deception, it may have used both. You can see how a detective in 1966 might follow each thread and find it fraying at the end. Witnesses could describe purchases, but not belief. Family could describe interests, but not the final plan. The case's coldness grew from those frayed ends. No confirmed poison, no confirmed third person, no clear motive, no reliable explanation for the masks, no surviving context for the note. You might think of a woven cloth with several bright strands visible, each ending before it reaches the border. The pattern suggests design, but the design cannot be completed from what remains. Even so, investigators continued to ask what the men had been doing in the weeks before the trip. Patient work often looks backward with special care. A final day may appear sudden, but it usually has roots. Who had they met? What had they read? What had they built? What did they say to friends, wives, colleagues, or fellow experimenters? The file becomes a net cast over ordinary life. Ordinary life, though, does not always hold still under that net. People forget dates, They protect reputations. They misunderstand questions. They tell the truth as they see it, then remember another truth later. You can hear the murmur of interviews in small rooms, cups placed on saucers, chairs shifting, rain beginning outside. The detective's pencil moves, stops, moves again. Every answer becomes a possible path, but not every path can be walked. There were accounts linking the men to earlier experiments, including ideas about contact, signals, or unusual energies. Some tellings mention previous incidents involving protective gear or attempts to receive messages from beyond ordinary perception. We treat those accounts carefully because old stories often harden into fact through repetition. Still, they show investigators had reason to consider the final trip part of a longer pattern rather than a single sudden whim. Patterns are useful, but they can mislead. If a person has explored unusual beliefs before, it does not prove what happened on a particular day. If a person knows electronics, it does not prove the use of an electronic device. If a note sounds ritualized, it does not prove a ritual caused anything. You and I keep these distinctions close, like small bookmarks placed in the margins. The moral patience of the file is found there, not in solving every question, but in refusing to confuse resemblance with certainty. The lead masks case has always attracted confident tellings, because confidence feels soothing, but a gentler kind of truth may be more faithful. We can say the men appear to have followed a plan. We can say the plan involved masks, a time, and possibly capsules. Beyond that, the ground grows soft. When the next page turns, it brings us back to the police work itself and to the limits of an investigation conducted in its own time. The officers in 1966 did not have the kind of database searching, trace chemistry, digital reconstruction, or modern DNA workflows that later cold case units would rely on. They had interviews, physical searches, autopsy reports, paper records, and human persistence. You can see the difference in the room. No glowing screens, no quiet electronic archive, only cabinets, folders, telephones, carbon copies, and names written carefully enough to be found again. That older pace could be both limiting and clarifying. A detective might spend hours traveling to speak with one person, then return with a few lines of statement. A record request might take days. A lab result might take longer and arrive with less precision than anyone hoped. You can hear footsteps in corridors, the stamp of a date on a page, the metallic slide of a drawer closing. The lead masks case needed speed in some places and patience in others. It needed the hill preserved quickly, the bodies examined promptly, the witnesses identified before memory shifted, and any substances tested before they degraded or disappeared. But it also needed long, slow inquiry into the men's lives, their beliefs, their contacts, and their workshop habits. That mixture is difficult even in a well-resourced investigation. If the early hours did not capture enough, later effort had less to work with. This is one of the quietest and most painful reasons cases go cold. Later, investigators may be wiser, better equipped, and more careful, but they cannot always recover what was not preserved. They can reopen boxes, but not the weather of the original day. They can reread statements, but not restore the first freshness of memory. You can feel that when you imagine the evidence room. The lead masks may sit in a labeled container, heavier than their size suggests. The note may be kept flat, protected from fingers. Photographs may show the hillside in shades of grey, the image grainy, the edges curling slightly. Everything is present, and yet the most important thing is absent. The scene cannot speak in real time anymore. This is why cold case detectives often become historians of small failures. Not failures of care, necessarily, but failures of timing, technology preservation, and luck. A rainstorm, a delay, a missing sample, a witness who moves away, a report filed under the wrong description. None of these alone may close a case forever, but together they can turn a clear path into a field of faint tracks. The lead masks case seems to have suffered from several such faint tracks. The official investigation did not produce a firm cause. Public speculation blurred the cleaner lines. The men's possible beliefs widened the field of inquiry instead of narrowing it. And the oddness of the evidence drew attention toward explanations that were difficult to test. A case can become famous and cold at the same time. Fame can preserve names, but it can also preserve distortions. You may have noticed this in other old mysteries. A single striking detail becomes the doorway everyone uses, and soon the doorway seems like the whole house. In this case, the masks became that doorway. They kept people returning, which matters, but they also sometimes pulled attention away from the practical question of who knew what, when, and why. So we return to the practical questions. Who last spoke with Manuel and Miguel before they traveled? What did they say about the purpose of the trip? Who expected them back? What equipment, if any, did they carry? Where were the masks made? What were the capsules, if there were capsules? Did the men meet anyone in Niterói? Did anyone benefit from their deaths or from their absence? Some of these questions may have been asked. Some may have been answered only partly. Some answers may be sitting in records not widely available, or lost, or never written down in the first place. You can feel the archivist's patience here, the way a person opens box after box, not expecting drama, only hoping for a paper folded into the wrong folder. Sometimes that is how old cases move. A misplaced page can change the weight of a case. A receipt can anchor a timeline. A lab note can rule out a theory. A witness statement can show that a rumor began later than people thought. But the lead masks case has remained stubborn, and its surviving public shape still circles the same few objects. The note, the masks, the hill, the raincoats, the missing cause. There is a kind of gentleness in admitting that stubbornness. We do not have to make the case yield tonight. We only have to listen well. You lean closer to the file, not because it is loud, but because it is quiet. The old paper gives a soft rasp as it moves. Somewhere outside the imagined archive, traffic thins, and the night takes on that deep blue weight that makes small desk lamps feel protective. As the years passed, the men themselves could be overshadowed by the mythology of the case. That happens easily. A title becomes shorthand. The Lieb masks case becomes a phrase, and a phrase can harden around the people inside it. We loosen it a little when we say their names again. Manuel Pereira da Cruz, Miguel Jose Viana, two men who left home with plans that did not return with them. You can sit with the families again for a moment. They would not have experienced the case as a puzzle first. They would have experienced it as absence, paperwork, questions, and perhaps the discomfort of public curiosity. Their private grief became attached to strange public images. That is a heavy thing for any family to carry. Patient narration should leave room for that weight without turning it into spectacle. A compassionate investigator also remembers the witnesses kindly. It is easy years later to wish each person had noticed more. But people in ordinary life are not trained to preserve future mysteries. They sell coats. They sell water. They pass men on a road. They see weather, clothing, gestures, and faces without knowing which detail will later be needed. Memory is not a camera. It is a living thing. So when a witness account varies, we do not immediately assume bad faith. We ask what time passed between event and statement. We ask what the witness had read or heard. We ask whether the question shaped the answer. We ask whether the person was frightened, flattered, confused, or trying to help. In the Lieb masks case, as in many old files, the wish to help may have produced more words than certainty. The police had to work inside that human mixture. They had to listen to claims of lights or rituals, and also to the simple commercial facts of purchases. They had to consider crime without clear signs of a struggle. They had to consider accident without knowing the substance. They had to consider self-directed experiment without reducing the men to caricature. Each path required care, and each path thinned before it reached the end. By now, you may feel the rhythm of the case. It offers a fact, then a question. It offers an object, then a missing context. It offers a journey, then a silence. This rhythm is one reason it stayed unresolved in public memory, because the mind keeps waiting for the next page to complete the previous one. Yet every next page only deepens the same patient circle. But there was another kind of silence around the case, the silence of chemistry that never gave its clear answer. If the men took capsules, the contents should have mattered. That sentence seems straightforward, almost too straightforward, and perhaps that is why the uncertainty feels so persistent. The note's instruction points toward ingestion, and ingestion points toward toxicology, and toxicology should point toward a substance. But the chain does not complete itself. Somewhere along the way, the evidence did not hold. You can imagine small laboratory containers, glass, labels, instruments, and the faint chemical smell of older forensic rooms. The work would have depended on what samples remained, how they were stored, what tests were available, and what substances examiners thought to look for. A test can miss what it is not designed to find. A degraded sample can fail to speak. A result can be too limited to become proof. This is not unusual in old cases. Modern viewers sometimes look backward with modern expectations, assuming that every unknown substance leaves a recoverable signature. But older investigations often faced narrower tools, slower procedures, and less standardized handling. The lead masks case lives partly in that gap between what we now wish had been done and what could be done then, under those conditions, with those resources. If the capsules were harmless, then the note misleads us. If they were harmful, the test did not preserve the answer publicly. If they were never taken, then the men either ignored the instruction or the note meant something else. If someone removed evidence, that introduces another uncertainty. You see how quickly one missing fact becomes a branching tree, each branch pale in the archive light. The patient way is to trace each branch only as far as it can bear weight. Poisoning remains a theory because of the note and the unclear cause. It does not become certainty without a confirmed substance. Accident remains possible if the men consume something they misunderstood. Deception remains possible if another person supplied it. Self-directed ritual remains possible if the men believe the act served a purpose. None can stand alone as the final answer. This is why, after so many years, the case is often described as unsolved rather than merely unexplained. Unexplained would mean strange facts without enough inquiry. Unsolved carries the sense of questions that were pursued and still resisted. The difference matters. You and I are not looking at a sealed myth. We are looking at an investigation that touched real ground, real objects, real people, and still could not close. There is a softness to the word unsolved when spoken at night. It does not have to feel sharp. It can mean the file remains open in the human sense, not necessarily on a detective's desk, but in memory and care. The questions are still there, stacked neatly, waiting. You do not have to answer them all before resting. You can simply understand why they lasted. The lead masks case went cold because no single piece of evidence became strong enough to gather the others around it. The note did not name the writer's full world. The masks did not explain their purpose. The witnesses did not describe the final hours fully. The autopsy did not settle the cause. The theories multiplied, and multiplication can scatter an investigation if proof does not arrive to hold it steady. Still, the multiplication tells us something about the case's emotional force. People kept trying because the scenes seemed intentional. Randomness is difficult, but intention without explanation is sometimes harder. If the men prepared, then preparation had meaning. If they waited, then they waited for something. If they trusted, then someone or something had earned that trust. These are human questions, and they linger because they feel close to ordinary life. We all know what it is to follow instructions we believe we understand. We all know what it is to trust a plan, a friend, a map, a note in our own handwriting. The lead masks case feels distant because of its details, but close because of that simple human act. Two men went where they meant to go, carrying objects they meant to carry, and the reason did not survive clearly enough. When the next page lifts, it carries us into the quieter question of belief, and how belief can enter a case without becoming an accusation. Belief is not evidence by itself. It is a lens, a motive, a comfort, sometimes a risk, and often a private room. Investigators looking into Manuel and Miguel's interests had to understand what ideas may have shaped their choices without treating those ideas as an easy answer. Many people hold unusual beliefs and never come to harm. Many experiment, pray, hope, and wonder without stepping outside ordinary safety. You can imagine the men talking with others after work, perhaps in a workshop, perhaps in a home, perhaps around a table where cups left rings on the surface. The air might smell of coffee, soda, paper, and rain drying from clothes. Someone speaks about signals. Someone else mentions energy, spirits, contact, or protection. The conversation may have been sincere, technical, speculative, or all of these at once. In the 1960s, spiritualist thought and technical curiosity could overlap in ways that feel unfamiliar now but were not impossible then. Radios received voices from far away. Television carried images through the air. Space exploration was changing the public imagination. A person could look upward at night and feel the world had become much larger within a single lifetime. The border between science, hope, and wonder was porous for many. The lead mask's case sits inside that cultural weather, not as proof of any extraordinary claim, but as a reminder that the men's choices may have made sense within a community of ideas around them. If they expected a signal, perhaps signal had a meaning shared by others. If they protected metals, perhaps the phrase belonged to a set of instructions now lost. If they used lead, perhaps they believed lead was necessary. You can feel how frustrating that is for an investigator. Belief leaves traces, but they are often verbal, social, and fragile. A receipt for lead sheeting would be useful. A named organizer would be useful. Instead, the file gives suggestions, memories, and a note. It is enough to point, not enough to arrive. That pointing created decades of speculation. Some people favored an accident during a spiritual or pseudo-scientific experiment. Some suspected fraud or manipulation. Some wondered whether the men were lured. Some focused on possible toxins. Some wandered far beyond what the evidence can hold. You and I keep our chair close to the desk, where the lamplight reaches the paper and the floorboards do not creak too loudly beneath us. The gentlest reading may be that the men were searching for something. Not necessarily something foolish and not necessarily something wise, but something they believed was worth a journey. People search in many ways. They search with prayer, instruments, notebooks, rituals, machines, and faith. Sometimes the search is dignified even when the method is mistaken. Sometimes it is vulnerable. Often it is both. If another person exploited that search, the case becomes sad in a different way. But exploitation would need proof. A name, a witness, a transaction, a substance traced back to a supplier. Without those, the idea remains a concern, not an answer. The cold file asks us to hold concern gently, without pretending it is enough to convict the empty space. The patient detective tonight, which is you in this room of paper and quiet, keeps a separate page for what is known and what is wondered. On the known page, the writing is spare. Names, date, city, hill, objects, note. No confirmed cause. On the wondered page, the writing spreads wider. Belief, signal, capsules, third person, accident. The difference between those pages is the difference between care and invention. You may notice how calming that separation can be. It gives the mind a place to rest. We do not have to chase every possibility at once. We can let each possibility sit in its own chair, quiet and unproven. The room does not become empty. It becomes orderly. The case remains unsolved, but the thinking around it becomes less fevered. That order is important because the lead mask's case has often been treated as a curiosity first and a human case second. The strange image can make people forget the slow labor behind the investigation. But someone had to retrieve the bodies from the hill. Someone had to speak to families. Someone had to log the masks. Someone had to preserve the note. Someone had to decide which rumors deserved time. The investigators were human too. They may have been puzzled, tired, skeptical, open-minded, or pressured by public attention. They may have felt the weight of a case that looked impossible to explain cleanly. You can picture one of them late in the evening, jacket over the back of a chair, reading the note again under a yellowing office light. The words remain the same. The room grows quieter. In that quiet, the case becomes less about oddity and more about limits. The limits of science in its time. The limits of memory. The limits of language when a note is written for insiders. The limits of investigation when the final witness is gone. We can respect those limits without surrendering curiosity. In fact, curiosity becomes more humane when it knows where the edge is. Years after the first investigation, people would keep returning to the same phrase, awaiting the signal, and wondering whether the signal ever came. A signal is a promise of communication. It says something will be sent, received, noticed, or understood. For an electronics technician, a signal might be measured. For a spiritual seeker, it might be felt. For a person following instructions, it might be a sign to begin or stop. You read the word in the note, and it changes color depending on the light you hold over it. If the signal was expected from a person, then someone may have failed to appear, or appeared and left no trace. If it was expected from equipment, then perhaps the equipment is missing from the known scene. If it was expected from an inner experience after taking capsules, then the note belongs to a very different kind of ritualized preparation. Each reading opens a door, but again, none opens fully. The masks complicate the signal too. A mask over the eyes suggests not watching in an ordinary way. It suggests protection, blindness, concentration. Perhaps the men were meant to avoid seeing something. Perhaps they were meant to shield themselves from something. Perhaps the masks were symbolic more than functional. You can hold all three possibilities without choosing too quickly. Lead itself has a quiet authority as a material. It is dense, dull, and old-feeling. Unlike bright aluminum or polished steel, it seems serious in the hand. In many minds, lead suggests shielding, danger, medicine, industry, and hidden forces. If someone told the men lead would protect them, the material may have seemed convincing. Its very weight could have felt like proof. But the practical use of lead depends on context, thickness, exposure, and purpose. A homemade mask is not automatically meaningful protection against anything specific. That gap between the material's reputation and the object's real function is another small, cold place in the case. The masks may reveal what someone believed, but belief and effectiveness are not the same. Investigators could describe the masks more easily than they could interpret them. You can imagine the masks being made, a sheet laid on a bench, a tool marking a curve, the dull scrape of cutting, the faint metallic smell on the fingers, the edges pressed or bent into shape. Perhaps the work was done with confidence, perhaps awkwardly, perhaps by the men themselves while they believed they were preparing carefully for something important. That image brings us close to them without solving them. It lets us see the human labor inside the object. Someone spent time making those masks. Someone thought ahead. Someone carried them to Niterói or acquired them there. The case went cold, partly because that labor could be seen, but the thought behind it could not be reached. The hand remained visible. The intention did not. Old mysteries often preserve gestures better than reasons. A woman posts a letter. A man buys a ticket. Two technicians carry lead masks to a hill. The gesture survives because someone saw it or because an object remains. The reason disappears into the private weather of the mind. You and I sit at the edge of that weather, listening to rain we cannot quite see. The water bottle, by contrast, feels almost tender in its ordinariness. A person going to a hill might bring water because the day is warm. A person expecting to take capsules might bring water to swallow them. A person following instructions might buy whatever was necessary for the plan. The bottle sits quietly among the stranger objects, and yet it may be one of the more practical clues. If the men bought water shortly before going to Morro do Vintém, it may support the note's instruction about capsules. But support is not proof. They may have simply been thirsty. It is easy to forget thirst in a mystery, though thirst is one of the most ordinary human facts. The mouth dries, the sun presses down, a bottle is purchased. Later, that simple need is asked to explain more than it can. You can see how fair thinking must move. It acknowledges the connection, then softens its grip. Water could have been for capsules. Water could have been for walking. Water could have been both. This is not indecision for its own sake. It is care. The lead masks case has suffered whenever care has been replaced by certainty that arrives too early. The hillside, too, may have been chosen for several reasons. It was elevated, somewhat apart, open to sky, and known enough to reach. If the men expected a signal, height might have mattered to them. If they wanted privacy, the hill may have offered it. If someone instructed them to go there, the place may have carried meaning within that instruction. Again, the fact is simple. The reason is not. Moro du Vintem looked over Niterói and toward the larger sweep of Guanabara Bay. You can imagine the light changing there in late afternoon, the city sounds thinning as they rose, the grass catching its shoes, the air touched by salt from the water. It may have felt ordinary to someone who knew it. To the men from Campos, it may have felt like an appointed place. At 4:30, according to the note's wording, they were to be at the determined location. At 6:30, they were to take the capsules, spoken aloud. Those times give the day a slow internal clock. You can feel the 2 hours between them, not dramatic, just waiting. The men may have sat, stood, talked, checked the view, watched the sky, or listened for something only they expected. Those 2 hours are among the quietest unknowns in the case. They may contain everything or almost nothing. If another person came, that is where the meeting may have happened. If an experiment was prepared, that is where the preparations may have unfolded. If the men simply waited, then the waiting itself becomes the last known posture. You turn the page, and the page gives no sound from that hilltop interval. Waiting can be peaceful, but it can also be vulnerable. When you wait because you trust instructions, you give the future a kind of permission. Manuel and Miguel may have believed the next step was controlled, meaningful, and safe enough. That possibility is painful, because it suggests they may not have understood the risk, whatever the risk was. Yet we say that softly because we do not know. The file does not let us hear their conversation. It does not tell us whether they were excited, nervous, calm, skeptical, or practical. It does not tell us whether one led and the other followed, or whether both shared the same conviction. A cold case often leaves personalities flattened by circumstance. Patient retelling tries to restore a little dimension without inventing what cannot be known. So we imagine only the textures around them, not the words inside their mouths. The dry grass, the slope beneath their shoes, the weight of the masks, the folded raincoats or raincoats worn against the weather, the bottle of water, the paper note, the light lowering over Niterói. These are enough for tonight. They carry the scene without forcing it. When the file moves forward again, it reaches the discovery and then the widening circle of official attention. The discovery did not happen instantly after the men died. That delay shaped everything that followed. Time on an open hillside is not neutral. It changes what can be observed. It alters the body, fades traces, scatters, or fixes smells, invites insects and weather, and gives curious people time to come near once word spreads. We do not dwell on that, but we acknowledge its investigative meaning. By the time authorities fully understood the importance of the site, the scene had already lost some of its first evidence. In a modern investigation, an area might be sealed quickly, photographed extensively, mapped, and searched in fine grids. In 1966, on an open hill in Niterói, with a discovery that seemed strange from the first moment, the process was more fragile. The hill was not a laboratory. It was a place people could reach. You can picture officers climbing the slope in street shoes, perhaps carrying notebooks, perhaps shielding their eyes from the light. The ground is uneven. The air is warm. Voices carry oddly in open places. Someone points, someone writes, someone else looks toward the view, because the view is there whether the case wants it or not. The ordinary world does not pause for investigation. That is one of the gentlest sorrows of cold cases. The world keeps being ordinary around extraordinary uncertainty. Buses run, shops open, children fly kites, a hillside grows grass. Families cook dinner, not knowing yet which hour will divide before from after. The lead masks case unfolded inside that ordinary world, and the ordinary world left its smudges on the evidence. The young kite flyer's role in the discovery also reminds us that not every witness enters a case by choice. Some people simply find what others have missed. For a child or teenager, depending on the accounts, that moment would have been confusing and heavy. Later retellings may treat the discovery as a narrative detail, but for the person there, it was a real encounter with something no one expected. We keep that person in our compassion too. Cold case files are full of secondary burdens. The passerby who finds evidence, the shopkeeper who realizes a sale mattered, the family member who repeats the last conversation again and again, the officer who cannot close the file. Each person carries a different piece, and none of them asked for the whole weight. Once the men were identified, the case gained its longer geography hillside mystery. It reached back to Campos dos Goitacazes, to workrooms, families, acquaintances, and earlier conversations. You can trace that line on a map, northward from the bay, through roads and towns, back to the place where the men began. A cold case often has this shape, one place of discovery and another place of meaning. In Campos, investigators could ask about habits and beliefs. They could look for anyone who knew about the trip. They could ask whether the men had enemies, debts, projects, or plans. They could ask what kind of equipment they wanted. They could ask whether anyone had heard about the masks before. Each answer might have seemed promising in the moment, and then less firm under the next question. This is how a case cools. Not all at once. A promising lead becomes uncertain. A witness cannot remember the date. A rumor proves second-hand. A suspected substance cannot be confirmed. A possible associate has no clear connection to the final day. The temperature drops slowly, led by lead, until the file is still active in memory, but no longer moving in court or station house corridors. The phrase "went cold" can make it sound as though people stopped caring. Often, it means the case stopped giving. Detectives may still care deeply, but care cannot produce evidence by itself. Families may still ask, but asking cannot restore a lost sample. Researchers may still read, but reading cannot create a witness who was never found. The coldness belongs to the evidence, not to the people who remember. You can feel that distinction tonight. It is important. The lead masks case did not vanish because no one found it interesting. It remained famous precisely because people found it deeply interesting. Yet interest is not the same as resolution. 1,000 curious minds can circle a file, and if the central facts are missing, the circle remains a circle. Still, circles have their uses. They keep attention from fading completely. They bring new readers to old names. They preserve the possibility that one day a document, a private letter, or a family memory might add a small piece. Cold cases sometimes move after decades because someone kept the circle unbroken. You and I, turning these pages softly, are part of that quieter tradition. When the investigation widened into public imagination, the case began to live in two versions at once. There was the official version, built from reports, objects, times, and statements. Then there was the story version, shaped by fascination, fear, wonder, and retelling. The official version asked what could be shown. The story version asked what could be imagined. The lead masks case grew cold partly because the story version became more vivid than the official one. And vivid things can distract from plain ones. Official language says the men were found on Morro do Vinten, wearing suits and raincoats, with lead masks and with a note containing instructions. Story language leans toward the hill at dusk, mysterious signals, strange lights, and secret rites. The first may feel too dry, the second may feel too full. A careful narrator walks between them, carrying the names and facts gently. The public imagination often wants a single hidden key, a secret society, a failed experiment, a hoax, a murder, a message from somewhere beyond the ordinary. But the actual file may contain no key at all, only separate teeth that never fit one lock. This can be disappointing if you come seeking an ending. It becomes more peaceful if you come seeking understanding. Understanding can include why no ending came. We can understand that a delayed discovery weakened the forensic path. We can understand that uncertain toxicology left cause unclear. We can understand that private beliefs, if present, were difficult to reconstruct. We can understand that the note was too brief, the masks too ambiguous, and a witness trail too thin. These are not answers, but they are reasons. Reasons for coldness matter because they honor the work done. They show the case was not simply neglected into mystery. It was shaped into mystery by timing, tools, human behavior, and missing context. The lead masks case is not a locked chest with a visible keyhole. It is more like a drawer of objects whose original owner is gone and whose organizing system died with him. You might imagine opening that drawer now. A folded raincoat receipt, if one had survived. A scrap of lead. A bus ticket, a note in a hand that once moved easily across paper, a small tool with a worn handle. The smell is metal, dust, and old varnish. You lift each object and wait for recognition, but recognition does not come. Only questions settle back into the drawer. There is also the matter of translation. The note is often encountered by English-speaking readers through translated phrases, and translation can narrow or widen meaning without intending to. A phrase like protect metals may carry awkwardness from the original wording, or from shorthand, or from a technical context now missing. You and I should be careful not to build too much on a phrase as though every shade survived intact. Words move across languages like objects moved from one box to another. Most of the shape remains, but the packing changes. The lead masks case belongs first to Portuguese, to Brazilian places, to local police work, and to a cultural moment that cannot be fully carried by a few translated lines. We can still listen, but we listen with humility. The file is not ours to simplify. That humility also applies to the men's professions. Calling them electronics technicians helps us, but it does not tell us everything about their skill, their finances, their ambitions, or their daily pressures. A job title is a doorway, not a room. Inside the room are habits, friendships, frustrations, plans, and beliefs. The investigation needed that room, but time left only parts of it visible. Perhaps Manuel and Miguel were drawn to experiments because their work made experimentation feel natural. Perhaps they were careful men in some parts of life and reckless in others, as many people are. Perhaps one was more convinced than the other. Perhaps both believed they were taking part in something meaningful. We hold these possibilities like thin papers, not stacking them too heavily. At this point in the file, you may feel how the case has slowed us down. It asks you to read differently, not to leap from clue to conclusion, but to notice the distance between them. The water bottle is near the capsules, but not the capsules. The masks are near shielding, but not proof of danger. The signal is near technology, but not necessarily radio. The hill is near sky, but not necessarily anything beyond it. That kind of reading is almost restful when practiced gently. It lets the mind stop grabbing. It lets each object remain itself. The lead masks case becomes less a puzzle to conquer and more a set of human traces to keep company with. There is dignity in that, especially late at night, when certainty feels less important than care. But the file still has more rooms, and one of them holds the question of whether a third person ever stood close enough to matter. A third person is tempting in the lead masks case because the note feels instructional. Instructions often come from someone even when written by the person following them. If Manuel and Miguel were told to be at a certain place and take certain actions, who told them? If they wrote it for themselves, who first shaped the plan? The question does not accuse. It simply looks for the missing speaker. Investigators would have considered acquaintances, fellow experimenters, business contacts, and anyone who may have known about the trip. You can imagine names on a page, some underlined, some crossed lightly after interviews. One person heard something, another knew nothing, another had a theory, another had seen the men days before. The list grows, then thins, like a tide moving over sand. The absence of a clearly identified third person did not eliminate the possibility, it only left it unsupported. That distinction matters. Cold cases are full of unsupported possibilities that remain alive because they explain something emotionally, even when they cannot be used legally. A guide or manipulator might explain the instruction, a supplier might explain the capsules, a meeting might explain the hill, but explanation is not evidence. If there was no third person, then the men's own plan becomes more central. That leads back to belief, experiment, and misunderstanding. It suggests a private system in which the note made sense, the masks had purpose, and the timing mattered. This theory can explain some things, but it still struggles with cause. What exactly ended their lives, and why was it not clearly found? If there was a third person, the case becomes more socially complex. Someone may have guided them into danger, intentionally or not. Someone may have promised knowledge, money, contact, protection, or a result. Someone may have left before the discovery, Yet without a name, the idea remains like a shadow at the edge of the lamp. You can see its shape, but not its face. The file's patient lesson is that both paths can remain open without either becoming dominant. That is uncomfortable for the waking mind. For the sleepy mind, perhaps it is easier. We can allow the uncertainty to be what it is. We can sit beside it without tightening our hands. The questions are old enough now that they do not need to be forced. Consider, too, how the men's own agency must be respected. It is easy to imagine them only as victims of a strange plan, but they were adult men with skills, relationships, and choices. If they chose to travel, chose to carry masks, chose to follow instructions, those choices came from somewhere in their lives. Respecting them means taking those choices seriously without assuming they fully understood the danger. That balance is delicate. We do not mock their beliefs if beliefs guided them. We do not strip them of agency if they acted deliberately. We do not invent a villain if none can be shown. We do not call the case solved by accident if the cause remains unknown. Patient work keeps all of that in view, even when the view is dim. The room grows quieter as we stay with it. The imagined archive has settled around us, and the old fluorescent buzz has faded into the softer sound of pages. Outside, perhaps there is rain now, tapping the window in a way the hillside may or may not have heard in 1966. You turn another page, and the case waits without impatience. By the time later generations encountered the lead masks case, the world had changed around old evidence. Modern forensic thinking naturally asks whether preserved items could be retested. Could the masks yield trace evidence? Could the note be examined for handwriting, fingerprints, paper source, or impressions? Could clothing reveal residues? Could old biological samples, if preserved, offer any new insight? These questions come from a later age, one more accustomed to evidence giving up secrets under stronger light. But old evidence does not always survive in a retestable state. Items may be lost, degraded, contaminated, or kept under conditions that limit modern usefulness. Chain of custody may be incomplete. Samples may never have been preserved because no one expected future techniques. You can feel the sadness of that, not dramatic, just practical. The future arrives with tools, and the past has not always saved what the tools need. In some cold cases, modern DNA transforms everything. In others, toxicology archives reveal a substance overlooked at the time. In others, a fingerprint is digitized, a genealogy trail opens, or a forgotten confession is found. The lead masks case has not received that kind of public turning point. It remains in the older category, where the main evidence is interpretive, not newly technical. That does not mean modern thinking has no value. It helps explain the weaknesses. It reminds us that scene control, early toxicology, witness timing, and evidence preservation are crucial. It lets us see the case as a lesson in method. You, as the detective tonight, can look back without arrogance. The past had fewer tools, and the case needed tools it did not have. It also needed luck. Investigations depend on luck more often than official language admits. A witness looks out a window at the right moment, a receipt is kept, a bottle is not touched. A suspect says one sentence too many. A lab test happens before degradation. In the lead masks case, luck seems to have arrived mostly in fragments, enough to preserve mystery, not enough to resolve it. The men were identified. The note survived. The masks survived in the story, at least. The journey was partly reconstructed. Those are fragments of luck, but the crucial substance, if there was one, did not become known. The final companion, if there was one, did not step clearly into the record. The meaning of the signal did not survive. Luck opened the file and then left the room. You can hear the drawer slide closed for a moment. Not finally, just gently. The case rests, then opens again when someone returns to it. This is the rhythm of old mysteries. They do not move every year. They sleep, wake, are read, sleep again, and wait for a document, a memory, or simply a more careful listener. Tonight, that listener is you. As you continue through the pages, one thing becomes plain. The lead masks case went cold, not because it was empty, but because it was overfull with unanchored meaning. Every object seemed meaningful. Every setting seemed chosen. Yet, meaning without context is like a radio signal without a receiver tuned to the right frequency. It is present, perhaps, but not understood. That image would have made sense to Manuel and Miguel. A signal can pass through a room unheard if the receiver is wrong. A dial can be close but not exact. Static can mimic a voice. A clear voice can vanish with a small movement of the hand. The case itself feels like that, a transmission from 1966 that never quite tuned in for the investigators who needed it. We do not know whether the men thought in those terms on the hill, but we can use the metaphor carefully, because their world included equipment, frequencies, circuits, and waiting. A detective file is also a receiver of sorts. It gathers signals from objects, people, times, and places. In this case, the receiver caught fragments. The full message never became clear. When the next page turns, the handwriting of the note comes back into view, small and steady under the archive light. When the next page turns, the handwriting of the note comes back into view, small and steady under the archive light. You can imagine it lying there, flattened carefully, with the pressure of the pen still faintly alive in the fibers. A note like this has a strange intimacy, because it was never written for us, and yet here we are, decades later, reading it as gently as we can. The lead mask's case keeps returning to these few words, because they are among the only words left from the plan itself. The note did not explain its own terms. It did not say why the appointed place mattered, or what the capsules were, or what effect was expected, or what metals needed protection. It did not say who would send the signal, or how the masks were to be used when the signal came. You can hear the silence around each missing explanation. It is not an empty silence, exactly. It is more like a closed door in a quiet hallway. Handwriting can make an old case feel very near. Typed words belong to offices and reports, but handwritten words belong to a hand, a wrist, a breathing person leaning over paper. If the note was written by one of the men, then it may have been practical, no more mysterious to him than a shopping list. If it was written by someone else, then it may have been instruction, guidance, or manipulation. The ink does not tell us which. Investigators could compare handwriting if samples were available, but even a match would not solve everything. If Manuel wrote the note, who gave him the plan? If Miguel wrote it, did the words come from shared understanding? If another person wrote it, why was that person not clearly identified? You can see how each answer still carries another question folded inside it, like a paper tucked within paper. This is one of the quiet mechanics of the lead mask's case. It never quite allows a clue to remain simple. A bus ticket becomes intention, a raincoat becomes preparation, a bottle becomes possible medicine, a mask becomes belief or protection, a note becomes both evidence and riddle. You set each item down on the table, and each one casts a longer shadow than its size should allow. Yet we should not make the note more dramatic than it needs to be. The language may have been ordinary inside the men's circle, even if it sounds strange to us now. People who share private interests often develop shorthand. Technical workers do it, spiritual groups do it, families do it, friends do it. A sentence that seems cryptic outside the room may have been plain as daylight within it. You may have old notes like that yourself. A few words on a calendar, a reminder in a drawer, a phrase that would make little sense to anyone else. The lead mask's case asks us to imagine that same ordinary privacy, but under extraordinary circumstances. The note may not have been intended to conceal anything. It may simply have assumed a context that disappeared with the men. The phrase about capsules is the one that pulls the investigation most directly toward the body and the missing cause. To ingest something at a named time is an action, not only an idea. If the men followed that instruction, then the capsules might have shaped the outcome. If they did not, then the note describes a plan interrupted or abandoned. You underline the phrase carefully, and the pencil feels too loud on the page. Capsules are small objects, easy to carry, easy to lose, easy to misunderstand after the fact. They can contain medicine, supplements, sedatives, poison, harmless powder, or something made by an amateur who thinks he knows more than he does. The file does not give us a confirmed substance. It gives us the possibility of one. In a mystery this old, possibility can feel almost solid. Though it is not. You can imagine investigators searching for any source: pharmacies, friends, workrooms, bottles at home, conversations about experiments. The work would have been slow and ordinary, not cinematic. A question asked at a counter, a notebook checked, a family member trying to remember whether anything unusual had been stored in a drawer, a colleague thinking back to a remark that seemed unimportant at the time. The problem with capsules is that they sit at the crossing of several theories. They might belong to a spiritual experiment, meant to produce visions or altered perception. They might belong to a medical or chemical misunderstanding. They might belong to a deliberate act by someone else. They might not have existed at the scene at all, except as instructions on paper. Without the contents, the case cannot choose among them. That inability to choose is part of why the lead masks case remained cold. A theory that explains one object but not the others cannot close the file. A poison theory must still explain the masks and the signal. A ritual theory must still explain the cause. A criminal theory must still identify motive, opportunity, and proof. The file keeps asking for a whole explanation, and none arrives whole enough. You can rest in that recognition for a moment. It is not failure to see why something could not be solved. It is a form of respect. The detectives did not have a single missing answer. They had a pattern of missing answers, each one supporting the next in an uneasy way. When one question remained open, it kept the neighboring questions open too. But there was another quiet problem in the note, and it has to do with time. The times in the note give the day a structure, and structure can make a plan feel more real. Be at the place by 4:30, take the capsules at 6:30. Wait afterward. These times suggest that the men were not simply wandering. They were following a schedule. You can almost feel the afternoon divided into sections, sunlight changing on the hill while the appointed hour drew nearer. But a time written on paper is only useful if we can match it to what happened. Did they reach the hill before 4:30? Did anyone see them there? Did they take capsules at 6:30? Or was that only intended? Did something happen immediately after or hours later? The note gives a clock, but the rest of the evidence does not give enough hands to place upon it. Investigators would have wanted to know the last confirmed time each man was seen alive. They would have compared bus times, purchase times, witness estimates, and the note's instructions. But witness time is often imprecise, especially when people are asked later about a day they did not know they needed to preserve. The sound of a shop bell at 2 may become 3. Late afternoon may become early evening. Memory is elastic around ordinary hours. You can imagine a witness trying to help. They close their eyes. They remember the light outside the door, the angle of heat, the moment before another customer arrived. They think it was mid-afternoon. They are almost sure. But almost sure is not a timestamp. It helps the file breathe, but it does not let it stand in court. The 2-hour interval between 4:30 and 6:30 is one of those spaces where a case can hide. If someone met them, it could have happened then. If they assembled or adjusted something, it could have happened then. If they simply waited, then the waiting itself becomes part of the plan. You sit with that interval as if it were a quiet room, lit by lowering sun and unable to answer. Waiting also changes people. A plan that feels clear on the bus may feel different on a hill. After an hour in open air, one person may become doubtful, another may reassure him. They may reread the note. They may check the time. They may look toward the city, or the sky, or the path behind them. We cannot know these gestures, but the timeline makes room for them. We should be careful, though, not to overimagine. The file gives us enough to understand the silence, not enough to populate it fully. Tonight, we let the silence remain spacious. We notice the warm air, the rough grass, the weight of lead, the paper in a pocket, the water nearby. We do not put words into the men's mouths. We let their privacy remain. That privacy is part of the dignity of the case. Unsolved cases are often crowded by strangers who want certainty, but the people inside them had inner lives that were not public property. Manuel and Miguel had thoughts before the hill, thoughts during the trip, thoughts perhaps in that waiting interval. We do not possess those thoughts. We only see the traces of choices made around them. And yet the trace is enough to keep us working. Patient detective work lives on traces. A trace is not the whole person, but it is where we begin. The note is a trace, the masks are traces, the bus trip is a trace. Each one is a small pressure mark left by a life moving through the world, and the file asks us to read them without tearing the page. Years later, the case's timeline would be retold so often that it began to feel fixed, but old timelines deserve gentle checking. When you return to the earliest accounts, you notice how a date, a time, and a witness can shift slightly from telling to telling. One version emphasizes the 16th of August, another the 17th, depending on whether it refers to travel, disappearance, discovery, or reporting. One version gives a shop detail more strongly, another leans on the note. The lead masks case has passed through many hands, and each hand leaves a little warmth. This does not mean the core facts vanish. It means we read them with care. The men traveled from Campos dos Goitacazes to Niterói. They were later found on Morro do Vintém. They had lead masks and a strange note. The cause was not firmly established. Around those core facts, some outer edges of the story can vary, and a patient listener learns to tell the center from the mist. Mist is a useful image for this case, not because the hillside was necessarily misty that day, but because the public story has a mist of retelling around it. You can see the shapes, but some edges soften. The original police work is somewhere inside, firmer than rumor, but not always fully visible to every later reader. We move slowly, so we do not mistake mist for ground. The same care applies to claims about unusual lights. Many retellings of the lead masks case mention reports of lights or unidentified aerial phenomena in the region, or connect the case to the broader fascination of the period. Such reports may be part of the cultural background. They may have influenced belief. They may also have grown larger after the discovery. We do not dismiss them harshly. We simply keep them in their proper drawer. If someone saw a light in the sky near Niterói, that does not explain the deaths. If Manuel and Miguel believed in contact from beyond ordinary life, that does not establish what happened on the hill. If later writers connected the masks to radiation or spacecraft, that tells us as much about imagination as investigation. The case went cold in part because these ideas were difficult to test and easy to retell. The calm path is to ask what such beliefs could have meant to the men if they held them. Not whether the extraordinary thing was real, but whether belief in it shaped real actions. A belief can move a person across miles. A belief can make an instruction seem sensible. A belief can give a homemade object the feeling of protection. That is a practical investigative question, even when the belief itself remains unproven. You can feel the difference. We are not chasing lights across the sky. We are sitting at a desk asking what the men expected and why. The room smells faintly of paper, dust, and the cooling metal of an old lamp. The window is dark now. The case is not asking us to be excited. It is asking us to be careful. Careful thinking would also ask whether the scene could have been staged. Staging is a word that enters quietly, because it suggests someone arranged objects to create an impression. If the masks and note were intended to mislead, then their strangeness becomes a kind of cover. But staging requires opportunity, and usually motive. It also requires evidence that the arrangement does not fit the victim's own behavior. In the lead masks case, staging cannot be dismissed entirely, but it cannot be embraced without proof. The men's purchases, journey, and possible interests suggest they may have participated in the plan themselves. Yet if another person was involved, that person might have shaped the scene after the men could no longer speak. You see how the same objects can support different stories depending on what is placed beside them. This is why investigators need anchors. An anchor might be a confirmed handwriting source, a chemical result, a witness seeing a third person, or a purchase record for the masks. Without anchors, theories drift. They may remain interesting, even plausible, but they drift. The lead masks case has many floating elements, and the cold file is the attempt to keep them from moving too far apart. We can imagine a detective pinning a map to a board, though perhaps the real work was less formal. Campos, Niterói, Morro do Vintém, a bus route, a shop, a water purchase, a hill path. Then names around the edges, relatives, witnesses, colleagues, possible associates. The map would look like progress, but unless a line thickened into proof, It would remain a map of unanswered travel. Travel itself can be revealing. People rarely travel for no reason. The trip from Campos to Niterói took intention, time, and money. The men left their usual environment and entered another city. That means the important event, meeting, experiment, or instruction was tied to Niterói, or to the hill specifically. You pause there, because place is rarely accidental in a case this deliberate. Why Morro do Vintem? Perhaps it was isolated enough. Perhaps elevated enough. Perhaps known by someone in Niterói. Perhaps connected to a previous plan. Perhaps chosen for reasons that now seem arbitrary only because the chooser's mind is lost. A determined place, the note says in translation. That phrase suggests the location was selected before the men arrived. The hill was not merely found, it was appointed. An appointed place often has a story before the appointment. Someone has been there, someone has described it. Someone knows how to reach it. If Manuel and Miguel were visitors, they may have received directions. If they knew the area already, that would matter too. The file wants to know who first put that hill into the plan. The answer is not visible from the hill itself. You can imagine directions spoken casually. Take this bus, walk this way, climb until you reach the open ground, be there by 4:30, bring the masks, bring water. Wait. If the instructions were spoken, they vanished into air. Only the written reminder remained, too brief to reconstruct the voice behind it. Spoken plans are among the most fragile evidence in the world. The fragility of speech matters in many cold cases. A promise, a threat, a warning, a joke, a confidence, all may be heard by one person and forgotten by another. Unless someone writes it down, the words may not survive the week. In the lead masks case, so much may have been spoken before the trip, and so little of that speech remained available afterward. The note is a small island in a sea of lost conversation. But there was one more human circle to consider, the circle of people who shared the men's interests before the trip. Every specialized interest creates community, even if informal. Electronics technicians know other technicians. Hobbyists exchange parts. Spiritual seekers attend meetings, read pamphlets, visit mediums, and speak with people who share unusual hopes. Experimenters borrow equipment and ideas. Manuel and Miguel likely did not exist in isolation, and investigators would have needed to understand the circles around them. A circle can offer help or danger, clarity or confusion. It can normalize an idea that would seem strange outside it. It can encourage caution or encourage risk. If the men believed an experiment was possible, someone may have affirmed that belief. If they planned a test, someone may have discussed methods. If they trusted an instructor, that instructor may have belonged to such a circle. You can imagine a meeting room, modest and warm, with chairs lined unevenly and a table at the front. There may be pamphlets, notebooks, cups of coffee, a window open to street noise. Someone speaks softly about forces, energy, spirits, transmissions, or contact. Some people listen with hope, some with curiosity, some with skepticism hidden behind politeness. This is not a scene of drama. It is a scene of people trying to understand what they cannot see. The 1960s gave many people new reasons to wonder. Spaceflight had entered the public imagination. Scientific language reached newspapers and ordinary conversation. At the same time, older spiritual traditions remained strong in many communities. A person could hold a radio component in one hand and a metaphysical hope in the other. That combination may feel unusual now, but it was human then, as it is human in other forms today. If the lead masks case grew from such a circle, then its evidence may be the residue of shared imagination. The lead masks may have been a protective technology as they understood it. The capsules may have been part of a preparation ritual. The signal may have been expected as confirmation. But residue is not the same as a full account. We can see the ash without seeing the fire. Investigators would have asked who attended meetings, who spoke of experiments, who had access to chemicals or pills, who suggested the hill. But social circles close ranks for many reasons. Embarrassment, fear, loyalty, forgetfulness, distrust of police, or simple ignorance, because not everyone in a circle knows what two members decide to do privately. Silence can be protective, guilty, innocent, or merely empty. That is why cold cases require patience with silence. A person who says nothing may know nothing. A person who knows something may not understand its importance. A person who understands may be afraid. The file cannot assume. It must ask, wait, compare, and ask again. You can feel the slow rhythm of that work, like footsteps down a corridor that seems longer each time. The men's families may have known some of their interests, but perhaps not all. Many people keep parts of themselves outside the family room. A workshop friendship, a speculative meeting, a private hope, a debt, a plan. None of this is unusual. It becomes important only when the person cannot return to explain it. Then every private corner is opened by strangers looking for meaning. There is tenderness in recognizing that. The investigation had to intrude, because answers mattered. Yet the intrusion still moved through real homes, real grief, real drawers and workspaces. You can imagine a family member handing over a notebook, unsure whether it is useful, reluctant because it still carries the touch of the person lost. The paper may smell of dust, ink, and the closed air of a desk. The lead masks case asks us to hold both needs at once, the need for answers and the need for respect. We can look into the men's beliefs without reducing them to those beliefs. We can ask whether someone deceived them without assuming they were weak. We can consider accident without treating their final choices as foolish. The calmest investigation is often the most humane. Years passed and the official heat of the case faded, but the questions stayed vivid because they were arranged so precisely. A cold case with no clues can fade into silence. A cold case with one strange clue can become folklore. The lead masks case had several strange clues arranged in a way that felt deliberate. That arrangement kept drawing people back. You can almost see the objects on a table like a still life. 2 lead masks, a note, a water bottle, raincoats, suits, the bus route, the hillside. Each item points inward toward a center that remains empty. The empty center is the cause and purpose. What happened and why were they there? Most mysteries can tolerate one missing center for a while. This one has 2, overlapping. The medical cause was unclear, and the personal purpose was unclear. Without either, investigators could not decide whether to search primarily for a criminal, an accident, a ritual, a supplier, or an associate. The path kept dividing. You may have noticed that division in your own reading. At one moment, the case feels like a failed experiment. At another, like a possible poisoning. At another, like a private spiritual preparation. At another, like a scene arranged by someone unseen. The facts do not change, but the light over them does. This is what makes the file so hard to set down. For detectives, however, the file could not remain only fascinating. It had to become actionable. An actionable lead has a person, a place, an object, a test, or a contradiction that can be pursued. Fascination has atmosphere, action has direction. The lead masks case had atmosphere in abundance, but direction kept thinning. A case can be famous for precisely the qualities that make it difficult to advance. The popular versions often leaned into the most atmospheric parts, because atmosphere is memorable. The hillside, the masks, the signal. But the police needed plainer things. A purchase of capsules, a maker of masks, a witness to a meeting, a confirmed toxic substance, a motive, a surviving document explaining the plan. Without those, the case could be discussed endlessly and still remain legally still. You can hear the difference between conversation and proof. Conversation moves easily from perhaps to perhaps. Proof moves slowly, with weight. It must survive questions. It must connect cleanly. It must exclude reasonable alternatives. The lead masks case offered many perhapses. It did not offer enough weight in one place. That does not make the evidence meaningless. It makes it incomplete. The note is meaningful, the masks are meaningful, the journey is meaningful, the lack of injury, as publicly described, is meaningful. The unclear cause is meaningful, but meaning is not the same as resolution, and tonight we let that distinction remain soft but firm, like a bookmark placed exactly where it belongs. When you turn back to the hill once more, the landscape seems almost too quiet for all it has carried. Morro do Vintém was not built to preserve a mystery. Hillsides are careless archives. They hold sunlight, Footprints, rain, insects, wind, and discarded objects all in the same open hand. Unlike a room, they do not keep doors closed. Unlike a car, they do not contain surfaces neatly. Unlike a house, they do not remember who entered and left. The hill gave investigators a place, but not a sealed scene. Open-air cases are difficult even now. Weather moves evidence. Animals may disturb small items. People cross the area. Temperature affects decomposition and chemical traces. The sky itself becomes a participant, not with intention but with consequence. In 1966, those difficulties were even greater. The hill was a witness that could not be interviewed and a container that could not be sealed in time. You can picture the afternoon light moving across uneven ground. The grass has a dry whisper. The soil is rough beneath the soles. The bay below reflects the sky in pieces. If rain came, it would darken the earth and bead on raincoat surfaces. If the air stayed dry, dust would cling to hems and shoes. Every condition would matter, but not every condition would be recorded. This is another way a case goes cold. The environment has information, but the information expires. A footprint dries and crumbles. A scent fades. A residue washes away. A small object is overlooked because it blends with stone or grass. The file later asks what the hill knew, and the hill has already forgotten. You can feel the quiet finality of that, though we do not make it dramatic. The masks, being durable, outlasted the softer evidence. Lead does not forget as quickly as grass. The note, if protected, outlasted speech. The water bottle, if recovered, outlasted thirst. These objects survived because material survival is uneven. Hard things remain. Soft things vanish. Cold cases are often built from what happens to be hard enough to stay. But the hardest object is not always the most informative one. A lead mask can survive for decades and still not explain itself. A soft tissue sample might have answered the central question and yet not survive at all. This imbalance between durability and usefulness is one of the file's quiet ironies. The objects that remained were strange and vivid. The evidence that might have explained them was fragile. You can rest your fingers near the imagined mask, not touching it, only noticing the dull grey surface. It might be cool even in a warm room. It might leave a faint mark if handled. It looks like protection and blindness at once. That double meaning is part of its hold on the mind. It covers the eyes, and it also prevents us from seeing clearly into the case. There is a gentleness in that image, if we let it be gentle. The masks do not have to be symbols of fear. They can be symbols of mistaken preparation, of trust in an idea, of a human attempt to be ready for something unknown. People have always made objects to face the unknown. Amulets, instruments, helmets, letters, prayers, machines. The lead masks may belong, in their odd way, to that long human habit. Of course, investigators needed more than symbolism. They needed facts that could be tested. Who cut the lead? Where did it come from? Were there tool marks? Were there fingerprints? Were the masks made for both men at the same time? Did they fit? Were they worn, placed, or carried? Some of these questions may have been explored, but the public record has not produced enough clarity to settle them. The phrase public record is important. We are speaking from what has survived into public telling, not from possession of every original page. Some details may exist in archives we do not see tonight. Some may have been lost. Some may never have been written. The lead masks case, as most people encounter it, is a blend of documented core and repeated account. We keep that in mind, and it steadies us. A steady mind is useful because the case invites wonder. Wonder is not the enemy of truth. It becomes a problem only when it outruns the evidence. Tonight, we allow wonder to walk slowly beside us, not ahead of us. It may notice the moonlit shape of the hill, the odd phrase in the note, the handmade masks, but the file remains in our hands. But there was still the matter of why the men's plans, whatever they were, left so little explanation behind. People who prepare for unusual experiments often leave notes, diagrams, equipment, or spoken plans with others. They may tell a friend enough to be understood later. They may keep instructions. They may gather materials that reveal the method. In the lead masks case, we have a note, but it is skeletal. It is a set of steps without a theory. You can feel how that spareness deepens the mystery. Perhaps the fuller explanation was spoken and never recorded. Perhaps it was contained in documents that were lost or overlooked. Perhaps the men did not need to write it because they believed they understood it perfectly. Perhaps someone else kept the fuller instructions. Each possibility returns us to the same problem. The surviving words are too small for the role we ask them to play. The note's brevity also suggests confidence. A person writes short instructions when the rest is already known. That confidence could belong to the men, or to whoever guided them. It implies that by the time they reached Niterói, the plan had already been explained somewhere else. The final note was not a manual. It was a reminder. Cold cases often suffer when all that remains is the reminder. You can imagine a workshop table before the trip, with a longer conversation unfolding over scattered parts. Someone points to a page. Someone says the timing matters. Someone explains the metals. Someone mentions the masks. Someone says the capsules must be taken after arrival. By the next day, most of that explanation is gone. Only the pocket note remains, like the last leaf on a branch. This is why investigators would look for notebooks. Notebooks are where private systems sometimes reveal themselves. A technician might record measurements, experiments, sketches, frequencies, names, or costs. A spiritual seeker might write messages, dates, symbols, or instructions. A shared notebook could bridge the gap between technical and mystical language. If such a notebook existed and survived, it might have mattered greatly. But the public story of the lead masks case does not give us a notebook that explains the final trip. It gives us the pocket note, and then uncertainty. A missing notebook, whether real or imagined, becomes another shape in the room. You can almost see the empty space where it would lie. Its absence is not evidence by itself, but it shows what kind of evidence the case needed. Sometimes the missing document is the whole case, a letter that would identify the meeting, a receipt that would name the seller, a diary entry that would explain the belief, a laboratory note that would name the poison. Without it, investigators must reconstruct from fragments, and fragments are loyal only to themselves. They do not volunteer the missing whole. That may be why the lead masks case has such a lasting hold on patient readers. It feels as if one more page should exist. Not a miracle page, not a dramatic confession, just one practical page that says what the men thought they were doing. You can almost hear the paper slide out from between two folders. But when the box is searched, the page is not there. The absence of that page makes us attend to the people around the men. Someone may have heard a phrase that belonged to the missing explanation. Someone may have known about the capsules. Someone may have seen the masks before the trip. Someone may have understood what metals meant. Yet if those people were never found, or never spoke fully, or were not believed, the missing explanation stayed missing. This is the patient heartbreak of old investigations. The answer may not have been far away in the beginning. It may have been in a neighbor's memory, a colleague's drawer, a casual remark at a meeting, or a shop record kept for a short time and then discarded. Coldness often comes not from distance, but from nearness that was not recognized quickly enough. By the time everyone knew what mattered, some of it was gone. You sit with that thought, and the room becomes very still. It is not frightening. It is simply human. We rarely know which moments will need preserving. We throw away scraps. We forget conversations. We assume people will return and explain themselves. Most of the time they do. A cold case begins when someone does not, and the scraps suddenly matter. The men's trip to Niterói may have seemed like one more practical errand. If they said they were buying equipment, that would fit their work. If they mentioned meeting someone, it may not have sounded alarming. If they carried odd items, perhaps those items were explained within their interests. The ordinary world has a way of making unusual plans seem less visible, especially to those who love and trust the planners. That is another gentle reason not to judge the people around them. Families and friends cannot investigate every errand in advance. They live in trust, as all of us do. Only afterward does a question become sharp. Why did he say that? Why did I not ask more? What did he mean by that phrase? These are painful questions, and often unfair, because hindsight turns ordinary moments into clues. We place those questions down carefully. They belong to grief, not blame. The lead masks case had enough uncertainty without adding unnecessary judgment. The people left behind deserved answers, and they also deserved mercy for not knowing in advance what no one knew. You can imagine that mercy like a folded cloth placed over the roughest edge of the file. As the night deepens around our reading, we return once more to the reason the case went cold, not as a single cause, but as a slow layering. First came the delay and the open hillside, then the unclear medical cause, then the ambiguous note, then the masks, vivid but unexplained, then the possible beliefs and circles around the men, then public speculation, which preserved attention but clouded interpretation, then time itself, moving witnesses, fading memories, scattering records. Each layer is thin by itself. Together, they become the cool weight of an unsolved file. You can feel that weight in your hands. It is not heavy like the lead masks, but it has weight all the same. Paper can be heavy when it carries unanswered lives. The folder may be only a few inches thick, or thicker, depending on what has survived, but the emotional weight does not depend on volume. It depends on the questions still resting inside. The lead masks case is often described through its oddest objects, but its coldness came from ordinary investigative problems made sharper by those objects. Timing, preservation, witness memory, forensic limits, missing context, unconfirmed substances, no clear suspect. These are familiar problems in many cases. Here they were arranged around an unforgettable image, which made the mystery famous without making it easier. That distinction is worth keeping. Famous does not mean well understood. Strange does not mean supernatural. Unsolved does not mean unknowable in principle. It means the available evidence has not carried us to a firm answer. You and I can rest inside that distinction. It lets the case remain open without becoming wild. A quiet detective learns to live with several kinds of open. Open because no one has looked carefully enough. Open because the evidence was never gathered. Open because evidence exists but has not been connected. Open because time damaged what was needed. The lead masks case seems to belong mostly to the last two. People have looked. Pieces exist, yet the connecting tissue is thin or gone. You can imagine trying to mend an old fabric with missing threads. You can draw the edges together only so far. Pull too hard, and the fabric tears. Leave it alone, and the whole remains. The patient approach is to support what survives, mark the missing place, and avoid pretending the repair is complete. That is what we do tonight with this case. The file is still warm in one sense because we are reading it. The names are still spoken. The hill is still remembered. The note is still studied. But investigative warmth requires more than attention. It requires new evidence or a new way to test old evidence. Without that, the warmth stays contemplative, not operational. It keeps memory alive, which is something though not the same as closure. Closure is a word we use carefully. Families often need answers more than neat endings. A court may need proof. A historian may need context. A listener at night may need understanding of why the answer did not come. The lead masks case offers the last of these more readily than the others. It teaches why a file can remain suspended, even when everyone can see the strange objects inside it. When you look again at Manuel and Miguel, away from the objects, the case becomes quieter. Two men left home. They traveled, they followed, or seemed to follow, a plan. They were found far from home, and the plan did not return in words anyone could understand. Their families were left with official uncertainty and public speculation. That is the human center, and we keep returning there. The human center also includes the investigators who had to tell families what they did not know. That is a difficult duty. It is one thing to bring an answer, however painful. It is another to bring questions, especially questions that sound strange and incomplete. You can imagine the careful phrasing, the pauses, the attempt to be honest without making the unknown feel even heavier. In the office afterward, the file remains. Work continues. Calls are made. Reports are typed. The typewriter ribbon leaves dark letters on thin paper. Carbon copies smudge at the edges. Someone files a page under a case number. Someone opens the folder again in the morning. The ordinary machinery of investigation keeps turning, even when the central question does not move. That ordinary machinery deserves attention. Cold cases are not only moments of mystery, they are hours of clerical work, phone calls, travel, interviews, waiting, rechecking, and disappointment. The lead masks case would have required all of that. Its famous image rests on top of many unfamous tasks. Tonight, we let those tasks be visible because they are part of patient detective work. A detective might have checked transport records, another might have asked about pharmacies or chemical suppliers. Someone might have examined the men's tools. Someone might have read newspapers for reports of similar events. Each task could have produced a lead, or nothing. Most investigation is made of nothing that had to be checked anyway. You understand this if you have ever searched carefully for a lost object. You look in drawers where it probably is not. You check coat pockets twice. You retrace steps. You ask someone else. You feel foolish, then careful, then tired. A detective does this with higher stakes and greater discipline. The lead masks case asked for that kind of searching across cities, beliefs, and materials. The case also asked investigators to endure not knowing, while others speculated loudly. That can be difficult. Public theories may move faster than official work. A rumor can cross a city before a lab result returns. A strange detail can become a headline before it becomes understood. The detective has to keep working in the slower lane, where proof, not fascination, decides what matters. You can see why the file may have cooled even as the story spread. Attention does not always bring clarity. Sometimes it brings more statements, more letters, more claims, more theories, more pressure. Each must be handled, and handling takes time. If none yields a solid lead, the investigation becomes more crowded, but not more advanced. The room fills with voices, and the central silence remains. When later researchers tried to reconstruct the case, they inherited that crowded room. They had to ask which details came from early reports and which came from later embellishment. They had to decide how much weight to give each witness, each article, each translation. In that sense, the lead masks case became not only a mystery about 1966, but a mystery about how stories age. Stories age unevenly, like paper exposed to light on one side. The memorable parts darken, the dull but important parts fade. The masks remained bright in public memory. The exact procedural details may have faded. The note remained. The chain of custody, the lab limitations, the witness timing, these quieter matters received less attention. Yet they may explain the coldness better than the famous image does. That is why tonight we keep returning to method. We let the strange image be present, but we do not let it rule the room. We ask how evidence moves, how memory changes, how context disappears, how old forensic limits shape modern uncertainty. The case becomes less like a spectacle and more like a lesson in patient investigation. That is a calmer way to stay with it. But calm does not mean empty. The file is rich with texture, the dry hillside, the rubbery raincoats, the dull lead, the thin note, the bus seats, the shop counter, the archive drawer, the warm typewriter, the darkening window. These details hold the listener close, not to thrill, but to ground the mind in the real surfaces of the case. A grounded mind can notice compassion more easily. Manuel and Miguel were not symbols. They were men who understood tools, traveled for reasons that mattered to them, and entered a plan whose meaning slipped away. The investigators were not characters in a puzzle. They were workers facing limits. The witnesses were not props. They were ordinary people asked to remember an afternoon that had changed after the fact. In the lead masks case, even the theories should be treated with compassion when possible. A failed experiment suggests hope gone wrong. A deception theory suggests trust misused. An accident suggests misunderstanding. A self-directed ritual suggests longing for contact, knowledge, or transformation. None of these possibilities needs mockery. Each, if true, would still belong to human vulnerability. The word vulnerability sits quietly near the center of the file. To travel, to trust, to wait, to take instructions, to prepare for something unseen, all of this involves vulnerability. We often notice vulnerability only after harm, but it is part of daily life. We board buses, we follow maps, We believe experts, we carry notes, we meet people. Most days, trust works well enough that we forget how delicate it is. Perhaps that is why the lead mask's case lingers. It shows trust without showing us the trusted thing clearly. It shows preparation without the result. It shows instructions without the instructor. It shows a journey without a return. These incomplete forms feel close to the way memory itself works, offering edges and gestures while keeping the center out of reach. When you place the note beside the masks once more, you may sense how the case holds two kinds of blindness: the literal covering of the eyes and the investigative blindness that followed. The men may have believed the masks would help them face something. Investigators later faced a different kind of obscurity, with their own tools insufficient to see through it. The image is quiet, but it is strong. Still, we do not need to turn it into a final meaning. The case is not finished with us yet, and we are not finishing it tonight. We are following its coldness, layer by layer, understanding how old questions remain when evidence cannot make the last crossing. The page is still open, the lamp is still low. Outside, the night has settled fully around the archive. And as you turn again toward the earlier days in Campos, the file asks what the men may have carried in their minds before they carried anything to the hill.